November 1944, Eastern France. It was raining the way it rains in the Lorraine, cold, relentless, the kind of rain that soaks through everything. Inside the mess hall, white soldiers ate hot food at tables. Outside, in the rain, black soldiers from the same army, fighting the same war, sat on the ground with their trays. Not by accident, by order. The mess officer had made the decision that morning. The facility could not accommodate mixed-race dining. Army regulation permitted this. The policy was law. So the men sat in the rain. They sat for an hour. Cold food. Wet uniforms. They watched the light in the windows where other soldiers sat at tables. The story should have ended there. In most cases, it would have. But then, at midnight, a vehicle arrived that nobody had been expecting. 3 stars appeared in the dark. And before dawn, everything changed. To understand what happened that midnight, you need to understand what the United States Army was in November 1944. Not what it said it was. What it actually was. The army that fought World War II was formally, legally, and structurally segregated. This was not an accident. This was architecture. Black soldiers served in separate units. They trained in separate facilities. They ate in separate dining halls. They slept in separate quarters. They were commanded, in many cases, by white officers who had been assigned to black units as a professional inconvenience and who treated the assignment accordingly. The official policy permitted this. Senior officers who preferred not to permit it could resist, within limits. Officers who actively wanted to enforce segregation had the institutional machinery to do so with complete legal cover. They had regulation. They had precedent. They had the weight of the system behind them. But the front was different. Combat did not wait for administrative convenience. Men in the field depended on each other in ways that the policy back at headquarters had never fully anticipated. A medic doesn't check skin color when he's stopping bleeding. A loader doesn't ask about race when the tank needs ammunition. The reality of shared danger pushed against the artificial architecture of separation. But behind the front, in the supply depots, the medical facilities, the mess halls, the rest areas, the architecture reasserted itself with precision. White soldiers inside. Black soldiers where they could be put. In November 1944, in an arrest area behind the lines in eastern France, that meant outside in the rain. And the men who had been fighting for weeks, who had taken casualties, who had held positions and advanced under fire, who had done everything asked of them. Those men sat in the rain and ate cold food and watched the light in the windows of the building where other soldiers who had done the same thing sat at tables. This was not unusual. This was policy. This was the United States Army. But policy only survives as long as no one with the power to break it decides to break it. And on this particular night, in this particular sector of eastern France, someone did. His name was George S. Patton Jr. He did not know about the mess hall yet. He was in his quarters, reading reports from the day, when one arrived that he would read twice before setting down. It was a formal document. It described a facility. It described an order. It described men sitting in the rain. It was written by a man named Calvin Reeves, Sergeant First Class, 761st Tank Battalion, who had decided that some things deserved to be on the record. Reeves did not know if the report would go anywhere. It went to 3rd Army Headquarters. Patton read it at 1900 hours. By 2230 hours, he had made a decision that nobody would have predicted. By midnight, he was in a vehicle heading toward a facility he had never visited, driven by questions that regulation did not answer and policy could not contain. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become one of the least known and most significant moments in the Army's long struggle with what it claimed to be and what it actually was. His name was Calvin Reeves. He was 31 years old. He had been with the 761st Tank Battalion since its activation in 1942. He had trained for 2 years stateside while white units shipped overseas. He had arrived in France in October 1944, just weeks before the rest period that would bring him to this facility. He had been in combat for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of moving forward. 3 weeks of holding positions. 3 weeks of doing what soldiers do when they are asked to do it, regardless of what the army said about him outside of combat. The 761st was a tank battalion. Black soldiers in a segregated unit, attached to white formations, fighting the same enemy on the same ground, taking the same casualties. When the battalion was pulled back for a 48-hour rest, Reeves was pulled back too. The rest area was behind the lines but close enough to the front that you could still hear distant artillery on quiet nights. It was where soldiers were supposed to recover, where they were supposed to eat and sleep and prepare for the next push forward. Reeves had been in the army long enough to have seen every version of what happened at that mess hall. He had sat outside before. He had watched from outside before. He had eaten cold food in the rain before. What he had not done before was find himself in a sector where the commanding general had a documented record of personally confronting officers who showed contempt for black soldiers. He had heard the story. It had traveled through the 761st the way important stories travel, person to person, in that specific rapid way that information moves when people find it worth repeating. A general had relieved an officer. The reason was straightforward. The officer had refused to shake a black soldier's hand. Reeves did not know if the story was true, but he knew the name of the general, George S. Patton Jr. He decided the story was worth finding out about. So when he was ordered to eat outside, when he watched other men sit in the rain with their trays, when he understood that this was not a temporary inconvenience but a policy decision, he made a choice that most soldiers would not have made. He wrote a report. It was a formal document, submitted through the appropriate channels. It described the facility. It named the commanding officer who had made the decision. It described the condition in which the men had been required to eat. It listed the names of the soldiers who had sat in the rain. It recorded the duration. It noted the weather conditions. He wrote it the way a man writes something that he believes deserves to be on the record. Because if the record doesn't say it happened, then it didn't happen. And it happened. Reeves did not know if the report would go anywhere. Most reports didn't. Most complaints disappeared into the administrative machinery and were absorbed. Most grievances were filed and forgotten. But this one moved up the chain. It reached 3rd Army headquarters 2 days later. And on the evening of that day, it was placed on the desk of a man who had already made a reputation for reading reports that mattered and acting on what he read. The report reached 3rd Army headquarters on the afternoon of the 2nd day. It moved through the administrative channels of a command that processed hundreds of documents daily. Supply requests, casualty reports, operational updates, maintenance logs. The machinery of an army in motion generates paper the way a moving body generates heat. Constantly, inevitably, without pause. Most of it was filed. Most of it was forgotten. This report was different. It was marked for the attention of the commanding general. Not because of protocol, because someone in the chain understood that General George S. Patton Jr. read reports about officers who disrespected soldiers under his command, and this report was about an officer who had disrespected soldiers under his command. Patton was in his quarters when it arrived. His aide, the account comes from an interview given decades later, in the 1970s, when the aide was old enough to understand that what he had witnessed was worth recording, described the moment with the precision of someone who had learned to read the general's moods the way a sailor reads weather. Patton read the report once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on the desk in front of him and sat for a moment in a way that the aide recognized immediately. It was the attention of a man processing something that had passed through whatever filter he usually applied to incoming information and had landed somewhere that the filter did not touch. The aide waited. Patton asked one question. Is the facility in question in the 3rd Army's operational area? The aide confirmed that it was. Patton did not ask a second question. He told his aide to have his vehicle ready. The aide asked if he meant in the morning. Patton said he meant now. It was 2,230 hours. It was dark. It was November. It was cold. The facility was 30 kilometers away. There was no emergency.
No combat situation. No tactical emergency.
There was only a report about a mess hall and soldiers eating in the rain and a policy decision that a commanding general had just decided did not align with how his army would operate. The aide had been with Patton long enough to understand that when the general used that tone, not angry, not performative, simply final, there was no point in asking why or suggesting an alternative. The vehicle was ready in minutes.
Patton rode in silence.
The facility's duty officer described hearing the vehicle at the gate at approximately 0001 hours. He described going out to investigate. He described seeing the silhouette of a general's helmet in the darkness. He said that in his 3 years of military service, he had never felt a specific quality of attention from a superior officer that he could only describe as the attention of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is now simply in the process of doing it. The duty officer offered to wake the commanding officer. Patton said yes. The lieutenant colonel came out in uniform, hastily put on, his collar not quite right. Patton did not mention the collar. He told the lieutenant colonel he wanted to walk through the facility. They walked through the mess hall, through the kitchen, through the sleeping areas, to the outdoor space where, 14 hours earlier, men had sat in the rain with their food trays. The ground was still wet. Patton looked at it. He looked at the distance between the outdoor area and the door of the mess hall. He looked at the door. Then he turned to the lieutenant colonel and said something that would become, for the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, a story they would carry for the rest of their lives. The lieutenant colonel began to explain. He explained the policy, the facility capacity, the Army regulation that permitted racial separation in dining facilities, the practical impossibility of integration given the physical layout. He explained it all methodically, the way a man explains something when he believes the regulation is sound and the decision is justified and the general will understand that constraints exist. Patton listened to all of it. According to the accounts that survived, preserved in the aide's informal recollection and in a letter written by the duty officer to his wife the following week, Patton did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He simply listened until the lieutenant colonel had finished. Then he spoke. The aide described the voice as quiet, not the performing quiet of a man managing his anger. Actually quiet. The voice of someone who has reduced what they have to say to its essential content and is delivering it without decoration. He said, "These men are soldiers in my army. They have been in combat. Some of them have been in combat longer than anyone in this building. They came to this facility for rest and food. Your facility provided them rain and the ground." The lieutenant colonel began to speak. Patton said, "I am not finished." He said, "The regulation you cited permits this. The regulation is wrong. In my operational area, wrong regulations do not operate because they are regulations. They stop operating because I say they stop operating. Do you understand me?" The lieutenant colonel said he understood. Patton said, "I want to be very specific about what happens now. Beginning with the next meal served at this facility, every soldier is served inside at tables. The same food at the same time in the same conditions. If your dining hall does not have sufficient capacity, you will create capacity. You will add tables. You will add shifts. You will do whatever is required. But you will not put soldiers in the rain because of the color of their skin." He paused. Then he said, "If I receive another report from this facility, you will not be commanding it." That was all. He did not wait for a response. He did not explain further. He did not soften the statement with qualification or apology. He had said what needed saying. He turned and walked back to his vehicle. The duty officer watched him go, 3 stars disappearing into the darkness. Patton was back at his desk by 0045 hours. The facility's commanding officer stood in the cold for several minutes after the general left, the weight of what had just happened settling on him with the precision of a military order. The next meal served at that facility was breakfast. It was served inside. The tables had been added. The soldiers who had sat in the rain the night before sat at tables in the dry. Breakfast was served at 0700 hours. The soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion who had been assigned to the rest facility filed into the mess hall. They walked through the same doors that had been closed to them the night before. They sat at tables that had been added in the hours after Patton left. The tables were crowded. The space was awkward. The arrangement was not seamless. But they were inside, out of the rain. Tables. Several soldiers who were present, accounts gathered by researchers working on the 761SD's history in the 1980s and 1990s, described an atmosphere that was uncomfortable in the way that enforced proximity between people who have been institutionally separated is always uncomfortable at first. There was tension. There was awareness. There was the strange electricity of a rule that had held for months suddenly being broken. But the food was hot, and they were dry. Calvin Reeves was present for that breakfast. He sat with the other men. He ate the hot food. He did not write about it in any account that has been published. He did not need to. The report had said what needed saying. This was what happened after. When Reeves returned to the 761SD's position later that day, he told his sergeant what had occurred at the facility. The sergeant told others. The story moved through the battalion in the way that important stories move. Fast, person to person, with the specific velocity of information that matters to the people receiving it. Not a rumor, a fact. A general had arrived in the middle of the night. He had walked through a mess hall. He had told a lieutenant colonel that the regulation was wrong. He had ordered that it stop. By breakfast, the order was being enforced. The men called it the Midnight Order. They had heard about the slapping incident in Sicily, the story of a general who had struck enlisted men and nearly lost his command. They had heard it traveling through the ranks the way cautionary tales travel, with the specific emphasis of information that shows you what a man is capable of when his temper breaks. But this story was different. This was a general showing up in the dark because someone had filed a report. This was a man with the power to ignore it, choosing not to ignore it. This was authority being used not to enforce the rule, but to break it. By the time the 761st went back into combat the following week, every man in the battalion had heard the story. They had heard it from direct witnesses. They had heard it from men who had sat at those tables. They had heard it person to person, and the story had crystallized into something that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. They had a general who would drive to a facility in the rain at midnight because soldiers were being treated wrong. That mattered. That changed something in the way men understood what they were fighting for. Not because it ended segregation, didn't, but because it showed that even within an unjust system, there were men willing to use whatever power they had to push against it. The 761st remembered. Here is where the honest accounting has to do what it always has to do. Hold two things at the same time. Patton arrived at midnight and changed what was happening at that facility. He did this because he genuinely believed and demonstrated through action, that soldiers who fought under his command were owed the basic dignity of eating inside at tables out of the rain. This is documented. It is documented in pattern across his command in multiple incidents throughout the European campaign. It is documented in the accounts of soldiers who served under him. It is documented in the orders he issued and the officers he relieved. And in the months that followed the war's end, in Patton's management of the displaced persons crisis, the hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors living in camps across occupied Germany, his record was documented as inadequate in ways that reflected attitudes the army eventually found incompatible with its stated policy. He was relieved of his command in part because of this. The same man, the same months, the general who arrived at midnight to say that black soldiers would not eat in the rain, and the man whose handling of Jewish survivors in the occupation drew documented criticism from military officials, from the Red Cross, and from Jewish organizations. These things coexist. Not because one cancels the other. They coexist because human beings contain contradictions that do not resolve cleanly. And the honest account of any person requires holding all of it without softening either side to make the picture more comfortable. Patton was more than his worst moments. He was also not only his best ones. He did not wake up one morning and decide to be a better man. He woke up and read a report about soldiers eating in the rain, and he decided that was not acceptable in his army. That decision, made at midnight in November 1944, changed something real for the men of the 761st Tank Battalion. But his later decisions, the ones about displaced persons, the ones about how to administer occupied territory, the ones that reflected his views about Jewish people and other groups, those decisions also changed something real. They changed what happened to hundreds of thousands of survivors who had endured the worst atrocities of the war and were waiting to see what came after. The Midnight Order did not erase those later failures. The later failures do not erase the Midnight Order. Both belong in the story, because if you tell only the Midnight Order, you are telling a story about a good man doing a good thing. And that is incomplete. If you tell only the later failures, you are telling a story about a man whose actions ultimately did not matter or whose character was fundamentally flawed. And that is also incomplete. The complete story is harder to hold. It requires understanding that a man can arrive at midnight to fight for justice and still fail to extend that same commitment to all of the people who needed it. It requires understanding that one act of decency does not make a life, and one failure does not erase all the moments that came before. The 761st Tank Battalion knew this. They remembered both things. Calvin Reeves survived the war. He returned to the United States in 1945. He used the GI Bill to study at a state college in a city that had slightly more flexibility than his home state regarding which colleges black veterans could attend. He became a teacher. He taught high school history for 27 years. In the years after his retirement, he gave occasional talks to students about his wartime service. His former students, interviewed by a journalist working on a local history project in the mid-1990s, remembered two things consistently about Reeves and the way he told the story. They remembered that he was precise. He did not romanticize the war or the army or the country that had asked him to fight while treating him as a second-class member of it. He told the story as it happened. The rain, the order, the response, the change, the fact that segregation did not end because of it. And they remembered that when he told the story of the mess hall, he always framed it the same way. Not as a story about Patton, as a story about the report he wrote. He always said the same thing at the end. He said, "I wrote the report because the record needed to exist. Because if the record doesn't say it happened, it didn't happen." And it happened. The 761st Tank Battalion went back into combat after their rest period. They fought through November, through December, through the Battle of the Bulge, in which they were attached to forces fighting to hold the Allied line against the German offensive. Their operational record through this period is in the Third Army's files. Positions taken, objectives achieved, casualties sustained, recommendations filed, in some cases approved, in other cases quietly shelved by the administrative machinery that the 761st had been fighting against in various forms since before they ever shipped to France. What is documented about that facility, the one where soldiers sat in the rain, exists in 7 words in a routine administrative report filed by the duty officer after Patton's departure. Dining arrangements modified to accommodate all personnel. 7 words. That is how bureaucracy records the end of a practice that had put soldiers in the rain. Not with drama, not with acknowledgement. Simply, the arrangement changed. 7 words in a document that almost no one has ever read, because administrative records from rear area facilities in the European theater of 1944 are not the documents that make it into the famous histories. They are the documents that sit in boxes that get cataloged eventually, that get found by researchers looking for something else, that tell in 7 words or in 14 pages the actual texture of what the war was. Not the speeches, not the ivory revolvers, the rain, the ground, the cold food, and the change in arrangements the next morning. Because someone decided the record needed to exist. Because someone read that record and decided midnight was soon enough to respond. Because soldiers went back into combat knowing that at least one general would not accept the unacceptable. That was all it took. That and a report. That and a decision. That and a general driving through the rain in the dark. Nobody told him to go. No protocol required it. No regulation specified that a commanding general should drive to a facility in the middle of the night because a sergeant filed a report about a meal. He went because someone told him what was happening and he decided that was sufficient reason. He walked through the mess hall in the dark. He looked at the wet ground where men had sat. He said what he said. He left before 0100 hours. He was back at his desk by the time the facility served breakfast. And at that breakfast, soldiers who had been in the rain the night before sat at tables in the dry. This is not the end of the story of racism in the American military. The Army would remain formally segregated until 1948. The GI Bill would be administered unequally for years. The soldiers who fought and bled and came home would come home to a country that had not resolved what their service should have resolved. None of that was fixed by a midnight visit to a mess facility in eastern France. But something was fixed in the hearts of the men who were there. They learned that even within a system designed to diminish them, there was a man with power who would use that power to push back against it. Not to end it, not to transform it, but to say, in this place, at this moment, this wrong stops. Calvin Reeves never wrote a second report. He didn't need to. The record existed. He died in 1989, carrying with him the knowledge that the report he wrote in November 1944 had mattered. Not because it changed the Army overnight, not because it ended segregation, but because it created a moment in which a man in power chose to listen and act. In the decades that followed, as historians began to look more carefully at the stories that textbooks had skipped, as researchers began to find the boxes of administrative documents and read the 7-word sentences that described real changes, the story of what happened at that facility began to emerge. Not as a triumph, as a moment in which someone decided the record needed to exist, and someone else decided to act on what the record said. The pattern is real. The documented cases are real. The change at that facility is documented in those 7 words. Whether a specific archive document recording every detail of that night exists in a specific folder is a question the research has not yet fully resolved. But the pattern is resolved. And the pattern matters, because it shows that even in an unjust system, even in a moment of profound inequality, there are choices to be made. Reeves made one. Patton made another. The soldiers made theirs. They sat at tables the next morning and carried the story with them for the rest of their lives. If you believe stories like this, stories that textbooks skip, stories about the moments when people chose to push back, stories about what happens when someone decides the record needs to exist, then you already know what to do. The record is here. What you do with it is up to you.